The air in the long gallery of Whitehall Palace was thick and still, heavy with the scent of beeswax and the faint smoke of a distant fire. Outside, a London drizzle painted the high, narrow windows a soft, misty gray. But inside, the light that filtered through was a pale, uncertain gold, catching dust motes as they danced in the stillness. A low hum of muffled voices could be heard from the great chamber down the hall, but here, in this quiet, long stretch of wood and gilded portraits, there was only the soft rustle of silk and the deep, measured breathing of a single man. This man, a king, was Charles Stuart, King Charles III. He stood before a window, his posture straight and unyielding, one hand resting on the hilt of his sword, the other clasped behind his back. He had a reputation for a certain kind of stillness, a silent, stubborn resolve that could seem like calm but was in fact the very essence of a storm waiting to break. His gaze was fixed on nothing in particular, his mind, no doubt, traveling through the winding, troubled corridors of his kingdom. The whispers from beyond the door were of Parliament, of petitions, and of a growing chorus of dissent that had grown too loud to ignore. For years, Charles had ruled on his own, believing with every fiber of his being that he was a monarch by divine right, appointed by God himself to govern his people. To him, Parliament was a mere advisory body, a group of subjects who by tradition could offer counsel but held no real power over him. It was a view that had worked for his father, James I, and his grandmother, Elizabeth, but the world was changing. In the quiet of this room, with the weight of his crown pressing down, Charles I stood as the living embodiment of an old order that was slowly, inexorably beginning to crumble. The tension wasn't new, not really. It had been brewing for generations. When his father, James, took the throne, he had brought with him a firm belief in the divine right of kings, a concept that didn't sit well with the English Parliament. They, after all, had long seen themselves as a check on royal power, a voice for the gentry and merchants who paid the nation's bills. These two ideas, absolute monarchy versus a more limited shared power, were like two tectonic plates slowly grinding against each other beneath the surface of the kingdom, and now the ground was beginning to shake. Did you know that Charles I inherited this simmering conflict, and rather than diffusing it, his own temperament and deeply held beliefs poured gasoline on the smoldering embers? Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, let me know in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is for you. Charles was a quiet man, deeply devout and with a refined taste for art, but he lacked the political shrewdness of his father and the easy popularity of his grandmother. He was, to put it gently, a bit socially awkward. He stammered as a child and never quite grew out of a certain stiffness in his manner. He preferred the quiet company of his family and his paintings to the boisterous, often unruly debates of the House of Commons. But to rule England, you had to be a master of people, a political operator, and Charles simply wasn't that person. He saw disagreement not as a different viewpoint, but as a personal affront, a challenge to his God-given authority. This fundamental clash of personalities and principles would soon define an entire era. When Parliament tried to assert its authority over matters of finance and foreign policy, Charles simply dismissed them. He believed he didn't need their permission to raise money. He could find other ways. And so he did, through things like forced loans, essentially taxes he demanded from his wealthy subjects, and by extending old, obscure taxes, such as ship money, a levy historically used to fund the navy in times of war, to all inland counties in times of peace. These were clever, yes, but they were also deeply unpopular and seen as a direct circumvention of Parliament's traditional rights. The people of England, particularly the gentry and merchants who were being squeezed for money, began to feel that their property and ancient rights were at risk. The religious tensions didn't help either. Charles was a high church Anglican, favoring elaborate rituals and ornate vestments that seemed to many devout Protestants a little too close to the Catholic ceremonies they had fought so hard to escape. His wife, Queen Henrietta Maria, was openly Catholic, and her presence at court only fueled the anxieties of the public, many of whom feared a return to the Catholic faith. Charles also appointed William Laud as Archbishop of Canterbury, a man who shared his high church views and enforced them with a heavy hand, punishing Puritan preachers who refused to conform. This created a powerful religious opposition that was soon to merge with the political opposition in Parliament. So in the early years of his reign, a very clear picture began to form. A king who believed he was above the law, and a parliament that believed the king was subject to it. Charles's stubborn insistence on his royal prerogative and his increasingly desperate methods of raising money without Parliament's consent were not just political disagreements. They were a fundamental challenge to the very idea of how England should be governed. The stage was set, not for a simple debate, but for a showdown. As the quiet drizzle continued to fall outside Whitehall, a different kind of storm was gathering inside. It was a storm of words, of principles, and of a brewing conflict that would soon explode from the gilded halls of the palace and spill out across the fields and towns of England, a conflict that would change the nation forever. The silent storm that had been brewing within the walls of Whitehall Palace now began to spread across the land. After dismissing the Parliament of 1629, King Charles I embarked on a period that would later be known as his personal rule, or the 11 Years' Tyranny, to his more vocal critics. Without Parliament to vote on taxes, he had to find alternative methods to fund his government, which was a surprisingly expensive business, even in the 17th century. The most famous of these creative financial schemes was ship money, a tax that had traditionally been levied only on coastal towns in times of war to fund the navy. Charles, however, extended it to the entire country year after year, claiming it was for national security. This was a direct, unapologetic end run around the ancient tradition that new taxes required parliamentary consent. For a time, it seemed to work. The absence of a noisy, critical parliament made governing look a lot simpler, and in many ways, Charles was a more effective and efficient ruler without them. He focused on things like beautifying London and patronizing the arts, leaving a legacy of stunning architecture and a priceless art collection. He even managed to balance the royal books for a while, a feat his father had never quite managed. But this sense of calm was a mirage, a fragile peace built on a foundation of simmering resentment. The new taxes, especially ship money, were deeply unpopular. A man named John Hampden, a Buckinghamshire gentleman, became a national hero of sorts when he refused to pay his ship money tax, arguing it was illegal without Parliament's approval. The resulting court case was a major public spectacle, while the judges, appointed by the king, ultimately ruled in Charles's favor. The narrowness of the decision, 7-5, and the widespread support for Hampden's stance showed just how much public opinion was turning against the king's methods. Historians still argue whether Charles's personal rule could have continued indefinitely if not for external pressures. On one hand, he had an iron grip on the legal and political system. On the other, the financial strain and public discontent were growing to unsustainable levels. In a way, Charles was like a man holding his breath, believing he could outlast the need to exhale. But you can only hold your breath for so long. The real pressure came not from within England, but from Scotland. Charles the Bearded was also the King of Scotland, but he didn't quite understand his northern kingdom. Scotland had its own distinct legal and religious traditions, and their version of Protestantism was far more radical than the high church Anglicanism Charles favored. The Scottish Church was Presbyterian, organized around local elders and councils, with a much simpler form of worship. Charles, however, wanted to impose a more unified Anglican-style worship on them. In 1637, he introduced a new prayer book that was remarkably similar to the English version, an act that was met with fury and rebellion. The first time the new prayer book was used in St. Giles's Cathedral in Edinburgh, a local woman named Jenny Geddes famously threw her stool at the minister, shouting, "De il colic the wame o' ye, ye fowls loon," which roughly translates to, "May the devil give you a stomachache, you treacherous rascal." It was an undignified start to a very serious conflict. This single act of rebellion set off a chain reaction across Scotland. The Scots signed a document called the National Covenant, a solemn promise to defend their religion against the king's perceived innovations. They were so serious about it, they raised an army to defend their position. Charles, in a bit of a pickle, had no choice but to raise his own army to suppress this rebellion. This was a tricky situation because, as we remember, he had been ruling without Parliament, which meant he had no official way to raise the funds necessary for the military campaign. He gathered a rather reluctant army of English nobles and their men and marched north. This conflict became known as the First Bishops' War. It was less of a war and more of a tense standoff, and it ended in a humiliating truce for Charles. The Scots' resolve was strong, and Charles's army was poorly funded and largely unenthusiastic about fighting their Protestant neighbors. The result was a peace treaty in which Charles agreed to let the Scots handle their own religious affairs. But it came at a high cost. He had to pay the Scots army while they disbanded, which he couldn't afford to do. He was essentially paying his enemies to go away. This financial black hole finally forced his hand. With no other options, and with the Scots still occupying parts of northern England and demanding payment, King Charles I had to do the one thing he had been so determined to avoid. He had to summon Parliament. The fragile peace of the personal rule was shattered, and the long, slow grinding of the tectonic plates was about to become a full-blown earthquake. The king's financial predicament, born of his ill-fated war with the Scots, left him with no choice. In April of 1640, for the first time in 11 years, he summoned Parliament. This assembly, however, was in no mood to grant him the money he so desperately needed without first addressing their long list of grievances. Their primary demand was a clear and binding acknowledgement of their rights, specifically regarding the king's ability to raise taxes without their consent. The members of Parliament had not forgotten the forced loans and the ship money of the personal rule. For them, this was a matter of principle, not a simple negotiation. They wanted to permanently clip the wings of the royal prerogative. This Parliament, lasting just a few weeks, became known as the Short Parliament. The name is a bit of a historical chuckle, really, a little wink to the brevity of its existence. From the very beginning, the king and Parliament were at a complete impasse. The king needed money to pay off the Scots. Parliament demanded reforms before they would consider providing a single shilling. Charles, ever the stubborn monarch, saw their demands as an unacceptable challenge to his authority. Rather than compromise, he dissolved Parliament again, just 3 weeks after it had convened. He was back where he started, but in a much worse position. The Scots were still in the north, still demanding payment, and now they were beginning to occupy more territory. The pressure was mounting, and Charles was running out of options. By November of 1640, with the Scottish army refusing to leave northern England until they were paid, Charles had no choice but to call Parliament for a second time. This time, the mood in the House of Commons was far more determined, far more resolute. The members knew the king had no leverage. He was financially broke and militarily embarrassed. They knew they had the upper hand, and they were not going to squander it. This new Parliament, due to its unprecedented longevity, would become known as the Long Parliament. It would last in various forms for 20 years, a testament to its resolve and the monumental changes it would enact. This assembly was a different beast entirely from its predecessors. It was led by a group of skilled and determined politicians, chief among them John Pym, a man with a reputation for both sharp wit and a sharp tongue. Pym was a master of political strategy, a man who understood the power of public opinion and the art of the parliamentary maneuver. His goal, and the goal of many of his colleagues, was not just to rein in the king, but to fundamentally restructure the relationship between the monarch and Parliament. Their first order of business was to dismantle the king's personal rule piece by piece. They passed a series of laws known as the Triennial Act, which required the king to call Parliament at least once every 3 years. They also abolished the courts that had been used by Charles to enforce his will, such as the Court of Star Chamber, a body that had become a symbol of royal tyranny. They also, crucially, declared the ship money tax illegal, in a move that sealed the fate of the king's most loyal advisors. They arrested and impeached the Earl of Strafford, Charles's chief minister, and Archbishop Laud, his religious advisor. Strafford was a particularly hated figure, seen as the mastermind behind the king's more authoritarian policies. After a lengthy trial, Parliament decided to use a special act called a Bill of Attainder to condemn him. This was a direct, albeit legal way of bypassing a normal trial. The king, under immense public and parliamentary pressure, ultimately signed Strafford's death warrant, a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He later reportedly referred to it as a betrayal of his conscience, and it was a moment that showed just how much power had shifted from the king to Parliament. The execution of Strafford was a public spectacle and a stark warning to the king. His divine right was no longer an absolute shield. The Long Parliament was not a unified front, however. While most members agreed on the need to limit the king's power, they were deeply divided on how far to go. Some, like Pym, wanted to push for radical change, while others were more moderate and feared that weakening the king too much would lead to chaos. This division would become a major factor in the coming years. But for now, a precarious balance had been established. The king, stripped of his most powerful allies and his ability to raise money without consent, was a monarch in name only. The power had truly shifted. With his chief advisor executed and his royal powers curtailed, Charles II found himself in a deeply precarious position. He was a king without the ability to truly rule. The Long Parliament, emboldened by its successes, was not done. The political atmosphere, which had been tense for years, now took on a new sense of urgency and fear. This was amplified by a new, horrifying development. A rebellion had broken out in Ireland. The Irish Catholic population, long resentful of the Protestant English and Scottish settlers who had been planted on their lands, rose up in a bloody revolt. Exaggerated and brutal reports of Protestant massacres flooded into London, stirring up a wave of anti-Catholic hysteria. The rebellion in Ireland presented a difficult dilemma for Parliament. An army had to be raised to put down the rebellion, but who would command it? The king, as commander-in-chief, had the traditional authority to do so. However, Parliament, deeply distrustful of Charles, feared that if they gave him control of an army, he would simply use it against them once the Irish were dealt with. This fear led to a radical proposal, the Militia Ordinance, which would transfer control of the army from the king to Parliament. This was a direct assault on the royal prerogative and the single most contentious issue of the pre-war period. It was a clear signal that Parliament was no longer just seeking to limit the king's power, they were seeking to take it for themselves. In this climate of fear and distrust, John Pym, the leader of the parliamentary opposition, pushed for a more comprehensive statement of their grievances. In November 1641, he presented the Grand Remonstrance, a sprawling document containing 204 clauses. It was a list of every wrong the king had committed since the beginning of his reign, a detailed and scathing indictment of his personal rule, his religious policies, and his use of evil counselors. The document was not just for the members of Parliament. It was intended to be a public declaration, a piece of propaganda designed to rally the people of England to Parliament's side. It passed by a razor-thin margin of just 11 votes, which demonstrated the deep divisions within Parliament itself. The vote was a turning point, making it clear that a significant number of members, while still wanting reform, were wary of pushing the king to a point of no return. The Grand Remonstrance was a bold and provocative move, and it pushed the king's patience to its breaking point. Charles saw the document not just as a list of grievances, but as a personal attack, a public humiliation, and an attempt to completely strip him of his authority. The very idea of the remonstrance being printed and distributed to the public was in his eyes a monstrous subversion of the proper order of things. His more moderate supporters in Parliament, who had grown alarmed at Pym's radicalism, urged him to act. They believed that Pym and his allies were not just trying to reform the government, but to overthrow it entirely. Charles, convinced that his enemies were planning to impeach his wife, the Queen, and a handful of his loyal supporters, decided to strike back. He received word that the leaders of the parliamentary opposition, Pym, Hampden, and 3 others known as the Five Members, were responsible for inciting rebellion and conspiring with the Scots. He believed he had a chance to seize the ringleaders and turn the tide back in his favor. And so, on the 4th of January, 1642, he committed one of the most reckless and fateful acts of his reign. He marched to the House of Commons with an armed guard, a royal retinue unlike anything the ancient halls had ever seen. The king's personal soldiers waited outside, swords drawn, while he strode into the chamber. The atmosphere was electric. The Speaker of the House, William Lenthal, rose to greet him, but the king walked right past him to the Speaker's chair. As he looked out over the assembled members, he saw the faces of men who had defied him, humiliated him, and now seemed poised to take everything he believed in. He demanded that the 5 members be delivered to him. Lenthal, when asked if the members were present, famously knelt and replied, "May it please your majesty, I have neither eyes to see nor tongue to speak in this place, but as the House is pleased to direct me." This was a bold and defiant statement of parliamentary privilege, a clear signal that the House was an institution independent of the king's direct command. The king looked around the silent, sullen chamber. The birds outside chirped, but the chamber was as silent as a tomb. The 5 members, having been warned just moments before, had already slipped away. The king, defeated and humiliated, could only utter the haunting words, "I see the birds have flown." His desperate gamble had failed. The king's invasion of the House of Commons was an unprecedented breach of its hallowed rights and a clear sign that the political struggle had gone beyond words. From this moment on, a peaceful resolution seemed almost impossible. The king's failed attempt to arrest the 5 members of Parliament marked a definitive end to any hope of a peaceful resolution. The king had shown his true colors, revealing that he was willing to use force against his own subjects and even against the hallowed institution of Parliament. The citizens of London, already largely sympathetic to the parliamentary cause, were horrified by the king's actions. A mob of angry apprentices and merchants surrounded Whitehall Palace, shouting insults and demanding justice. The city and the nation were now a tinderbox, and the smallest spark could set off a conflagration. Charles, realizing he was no longer safe in his own capital, made the fateful decision to leave London. In January 1642, he and his family slipped away, heading north. His departure was not a retreat, but a strategic withdrawal. He was leaving a place where he no longer had control and heading to the provinces, where he still had a base of loyal support. The 2 sides of the coming conflict were now geographically and politically separated. With the king gone, the parliamentarians, still in control of London, began to prepare for the inevitable. They issued the 19 Propositions in June 1642, a final set of demands that were, in effect, an ultimatum. These propositions would have transformed England into a constitutional monarchy in which Parliament held the ultimate power. They demanded parliamentary control over the militia, the appointment of royal ministers, and the education of the king's children. For Charles, who believed his power came from God, these were completely unacceptable. He saw them not as a compromise, but as a complete surrender of his sovereignty. The Parliament, to a modern mind, might seem to have gone too far, but from their perspective, they were simply creating a framework to prevent a repeat of the personal rule and the king's recent abuses of power. The king's refusal to accept these terms was the final nail in the coffin of diplomacy. Over the summer of 1642, both sides began to actively prepare for war. The king established his royal court at Oxford, which would serve as his capital for most of the war. He called upon his loyal subjects to join his army, appealing to their sense of duty and tradition. His supporters, known as Cavaliers for their stylish and flamboyant dress, were mostly drawn from the landed gentry, the aristocracy, and those who believed in the traditional order of a divinely appointed king. They were a diverse group, but they were united by their loyalty to the crown. The Parliament, meanwhile, raised its own army, relying on the support of London's financial class and the Puritan-leaning gentry and yeoman farmers from the south and east of England. Their supporters, derisively called Roundheads by the Cavaliers because of their close-cropped haircuts, were motivated by a mix of religious conviction and a belief in parliamentary rights. The final, symbolic moment that signaled the start of the war came on August 22nd, 1642. On a windswept hill just outside Nottingham, King Charles I raised his royal standard. The wind, it is said, was so fierce that it blew the banner down, a moment that was seen as a terrible omen by many of his superstitious followers. The raising of the standard was an ancient feudal act, a ceremonial summons for all loyal subjects to gather and fight for their king. It was a formal declaration of war, a signal that all attempts at a political solution had failed and that the fate of the nation would now be decided by the sword. The early days of the conflict were a strange mix of enthusiasm and uncertainty. There had not been a major civil war in England for centuries, and no one was entirely sure how to proceed. Both sides were made up of a mix of experienced soldiers and complete amateurs. The Cavaliers, with their gentry background, were often skilled horsemen and possessed a natural aristocratic confidence. The Roundheads, on the other hand, were often more disciplined and methodical, led by men who were serious about their cause and who believed they were fighting a holy war for God and liberty. The armies would soon begin to maneuver, each seeking an advantage, each believing that a single, decisive battle would end the conflict quickly. But history, as we know, rarely unfolds so neatly. The clash of swords and muskets was about to begin, and a gentle calm was about to give way to the long, grinding horror of war. The raising of the royal standard at Nottingham in August 1642 was a declaration, a challenge, but not an immediate call to arms in a great, climactic battle. For the rest of the year, both sides were primarily focused on gathering their forces, securing their strongholds and maneuvering for advantage. King Charles I, with his court at Oxford, began to assemble a respectable army, largely made up of his loyal gentry and their tenants. Their uniforms were a colorful array of silks and lace, and their battle cries were for king and country. The parliamentarians, on the other hand, had the immense financial and logistical power of London behind them. Their supporters were a more motley crew, often dressed in plain, practical clothes, fighting for God and Parliament. The first major confrontation came in October 1642, near the village of Edgehill in Warwickshire. The Royalist army, having marched from Shrewsbury, had the element of surprise, catching the parliamentarian army, under the command of the Earl of Essex, a bit off guard. As was typical of battles of the time, the fight began with a cavalry charge. Prince Rupert of the Rhine, Charles's brilliant but impetuous nephew, led the Royalist cavalry in a thunderous charge that shattered the parliamentarian horsemen on the right flank. Rupert and his men, in their youthful exuberance, pursued the fleeing enemy for miles, riding so far off the field that they essentially removed themselves from the rest of the battle. This was a critical mistake. While the Royalist cavalry was off chasing down stragglers and plundering the enemy's baggage train, the parliamentarian infantry held their ground, fighting a brutal, slow-motion battle with the Royalist foot soldiers. The battle raged on into the twilight, a chaotic, swirling mess of pikes, muskets, and men. The cavalry, when it finally returned, was too late to make a decisive impact. As night fell, both sides were exhausted, their ranks thinned, and neither could claim a clear victory. The Battle of Edgehill was a bloody and indecisive affair. Both sides lost thousands of men, and the outcome was a strategic stalemate. The Royalists had failed to destroy the main parliamentarian army, and the parliamentarians had failed to stop the Royalist advance toward London. It was a sobering moment for both sides, a harsh realization that this would not be a short, swift war decided in a single, glorious battle. Instead, it was going to be a long, drawn-out, and messy conflict. The immediate aftermath of Edgehill was just as important as the battle itself. The Royalist army continued its advance toward London. They were so close, in fact, that a number of moderate parliamentarians, terrified of a Royalist attack on the city, tried to negotiate a peace treaty. However, London's population and the more radical members of Parliament were resolute. The city was a vast, sprawling organism, and its militias were ready to fight. They threw up barricades, armed themselves, and prepared for a siege. This show of defiance and the growing strength of the London militia forced the Royalists to stop short of the city, and they instead set up their winter quarters in Oxford. This was a critical moment. By failing to capture London, the Royalists lost the opportunity to end the war in its early stages. London was the financial heart of the country, and without it, the Royalists would always be at a logistical and economic disadvantage. The winter of 1642–1643 saw the war settle into a less dramatic but equally important phase. Both sides used this time to regroup, recruit, and consolidate their power. The country became a patchwork of Royalist and parliamentarian strongholds. The Royalists dominated much of the west and north of England, where their support from the gentry was strongest. The parliamentarians held the wealthy, populous south and east with a firm grip on the capital. The war was no longer about a single decisive clash, but about 1,000 small skirmishes, sieges, and raids. It had become a war of attrition, a test of who could last the longest and who had the resources to see it through. With the war settling into a series of smaller campaigns and sieges, both sides began to solidify their strategies. The Royalists, with their headquarters in Oxford, aimed to conquer key strategic cities and ports to choke off London and the parliamentarians' access to trade and resources. The parliamentarians, on the other hand, sought to hold their major strongholds and chip away at the king's influence in the north and west. One of the most important goals for the Royalists in 1643 was to capture the city of Gloucester. It was a major port on the River Severn and a vital link between the Royalist strongholds in Wales and the rest of England. Capturing it would have given the king a huge strategic advantage, effectively cutting off the western part of the country. In August 1643, King Charles I laid siege to Gloucester. The city was defended by a staunchly parliamentarian garrison, and its citizens were fiercely loyal to their cause. The defenders, despite being outnumbered, refused to surrender. They were led by Colonel Edward Massey, a man with a reputation for both courage and ingenuity. The Royalist forces, under the command of Prince Rupert, began to bombard the city, and the situation for the defenders became increasingly dire. They sent a message to London, a desperate plea for help, but it was a long journey, and they were not certain if anyone would come to their aid. The siege of Gloucester became a symbol of the war, a test of Parliament's resolve. Could they save a city that was on the brink of collapse? In London, the parliamentarians, recognizing the critical importance of Gloucester, decided to send a relief army. The Earl of Essex, the parliamentarian commander-in-chief, led his army out of London with the full weight of the city's support behind him. The march was slow and difficult, and the Royalist cavalry, under Prince Rupert, harassed them at every turn. But the parliamentarians pressed on, a slow, grinding force moving toward its objective. The king, hearing of the approaching relief army, was forced to lift the siege of Gloucester and intercept Essex. He abandoned the siege works and marched his army to confront the parliamentarian forces. The two armies met near the town of Newbury in Berkshire. The first Battle of Newbury, fought in September 1643, was another bloody and inconclusive affair, much like Edgehill. The fighting was fierce, a close-quarters brawl between infantry and cavalry. The Royalist cavalry, once again, was a powerful force, but they were unable to break the disciplined parliamentarian infantry. The parliamentarian pikemen held their lines with a surprising tenacity. The battle raged all day, from sunrise until dusk, and the casualties were high on both sides. A significant historical fact is that two of the king's most senior commanders, Lord Falkland and the Earl of Carnarvon, were killed during the fighting, a testament to its ferocity. As darkness fell, both armies were exhausted and had effectively fought to a standstill. The Royalists, however, had failed to stop the parliamentarian army. During the night, the Royalists decided to withdraw, leaving the path to London open. The parliamentarian army was able to continue its march, relieved to have survived the battle, even if it had not been a glorious victory. The outcome of the First Battle of Newbury was a massive strategic victory for Parliament, even though it was a tactical draw. By stopping the Royalist army, they had saved Gloucester, and more importantly, they had secured their lifeline to London. The king, for all his efforts, had been denied the prize he so desperately sought. This defeat, however, highlighted a major weakness in the Royalist command structure. While they had brilliant cavalry leaders like Prince Rupert, they lacked the disciplined, long-term strategic vision that was beginning to emerge on the parliamentarian side. The war was beginning to turn into a marathon, and the side with the better logistics, the deeper pockets, and the more disciplined army would ultimately prevail. For now, the pendulum of victory had swung back toward Parliament, and the king's momentum had been checked. The indecisive outcome of the First Battle of Newbury and the subsequent failure of the Royalists to capture London made it clear to Parliament that they needed a decisive advantage. The war was dragging on, and they had been unable to deliver a knockout blow to the king. The most powerful force in the United Kingdom, however, was not on English soil. It was in Scotland. The Scots, having already humbled Charles I in the Bishops' Wars, had a disciplined and battle-hardened army that could turn the tide of the conflict. In order to secure their aid, Parliament was willing to pay a high price. In late 1643, representatives from the English Parliament and the Scottish Covenanters signed a treaty known as the Solemn League and Covenant. This was not just a military alliance, it was a religious and political one. The Scottish Covenanters, as a reminder, were fiercely Presbyterian and were deeply concerned about the spread of what they considered to be popish innovations in the English Church. In exchange for sending their army to fight alongside the parliamentarians against the king, they demanded that the English Parliament agree to reform the Church of England according to the Word of God and the example of the best Reformed churches, which everyone knew was a polite way of saying the Presbyterian Church of Scotland. This agreement was a major turning point in the war. It was a Faustian bargain for some in Parliament. While many Puritans were happy to embrace the idea of a Presbyterian church, others, particularly the more moderate members, were concerned about what it would mean for the traditional structure of the Church of England. They feared that a new, rigid religious system would replace the old one, and that they would be simply trading one form of religious control for another. Regardless, the need for military assistance outweighed these concerns. The promise of a Scottish army marching south was too great to pass up. And so, in early 1644, a Scottish army of about 20,000 men, under the command of the Earl of Leven, crossed the border and entered England. Their presence was immediately felt. They marched into the north, besieging the key royalist city of Newcastle and putting pressure on the king's northern garrisons. This forced Charles to split his forces and to defend multiple fronts, something he could ill afford to do. The Scots' entry into the war was a huge strategic advantage for Parliament, but it also introduced a new layer of political complexity. There were now 3 major factions with armies in the field: the Royalists, the Parliamentarians, and the Scots, all with slightly different motivations and goals. While this was happening, a different kind of change was taking place within the parliamentarian ranks. The existing parliamentary army was a patchwork of different regional forces, often poorly disciplined and led by commanders who were more interested in protecting their own counties than in fighting a coordinated war. But one of these regional forces, the Eastern Association, was beginning to stand out. It was a combined army from the counties of East Anglia, and its cavalry was led by a man named Oliver Cromwell. Cromwell, a gentleman farmer and a member of Parliament, was a relative unknown at the beginning of the war. But he was a man of deep Puritan conviction and a rare talent for military organization. He believed that God was on the side of Parliament, and that a successful army needed to be not only disciplined, but also filled with men who were fighting for a cause they truly believed in. He famously wrote to a fellow officer, Ironsides, the name given to his regiment for their resilience, that he would rather have a soldier who knows what he fights for and loves what he knows than what you call a gentleman. This was a revolutionary idea at the time, a departure from the traditional aristocratic model of warfare. Cromwell's cavalry was well trained, well equipped, and most importantly, they were motivated. Their discipline and religious zeal would soon make them the most feared cavalry force in the land, a fact that would become brutally apparent in the coming battles. With the Scots now in the north, the parliamentarians finally had the numerical and strategic advantage they had been seeking. The Royalist army in the north, under the command of the Marquis of Newcastle, was besieged in the city of York by a combined force of parliamentarians and Scots. This was a critical moment. If York fell, the king would lose his last major base of operations in the north. Prince Rupert, the king's brilliant but reckless cavalry commander, was dispatched from Oxford with a relief army to save the city. Rupert, against the king's express orders not to risk a battle, saw an opportunity for a decisive engagement. He managed to relieve the city, but instead of withdrawing, he chose to engage the combined parliamentary and Scottish armies on a vast field of turnips and rye, a place called Marston Moor. On a sweltering July evening in 1644, one of the largest battles ever fought on English soil was about to begin. The parliamentarian and Scottish forces, over 27,000 strong, faced a royalist army of around 18,000. Both armies were exhausted from the day's marches, and the commanders on both sides had decided to postpone the battle until the next morning. But as dusk began to fall, an unexpected and dramatic event occurred. Oliver Cromwell, commanding the parliamentarian left flank, saw an opening. His cavalry, the legendary Ironsides, were disciplined and ready. He launched a surprise charge against the royalist right flank, which was under the command of Prince Rupert. The attack was swift and devastating. The royalist cavalry, caught off guard, broke and fled. Rupert, in an unfortunate echo of his mistake at Edgehill, was unable to stop his men from fleeing. Meanwhile, the rest of the battle was a swirling, confused mess. On the opposite flank, the parliamentarian cavalry was routed, and the infantry in the center was in a desperate, grinding struggle. For a moment, it seemed as if the royalists might still win the day, but Oliver Cromwell, having swept the royalist right flank from the field, showed his true genius. Instead of pursuing the fleeing enemy, he reined in his cavalry, regrouped them, and with the help of the Scottish cavalry, charged into the royalist infantry from the rear. It was a perfectly executed maneuver, a moment of discipline and strategic vision that sealed the fate of the battle. The Royalist infantry, attacked from two sides, collapsed. The Battle of Marston Moor was a cataclysmic defeat for the Royalists. They lost over 4,000 men and all of their artillery and baggage. A mainstream historical fact is that the victory at Marston Moor was the first major battle won by the parliamentarians. The king's army in the north was effectively destroyed. The northern counties, once a royalist stronghold, now fell entirely into Parliament's hands. Prince Rupert, who had promised the king a victory or his head, was disgraced. The victory was a massive propaganda coup for Parliament and a huge boost to the morale of the Roundheads. It also solidified the reputation of a relatively unknown cavalry commander named Oliver Cromwell, whose decisive action had turned a near defeat into a resounding victory. The king's cause was now in serious trouble. He was still in control of a good portion of the country, but his best army had just been annihilated. The war was far from over, but the tide had turned, and the currents were now flowing strongly against the monarchy. The road ahead for the king was looking increasingly bleak. The devastating defeat at Marston Moor had revealed a fundamental truth about the parliamentarian forces. Their success was not consistent. While Oliver Cromwell and his disciplined cavalry had proven to be a decisive force, the rest of the parliamentary army was still a collection of regional militias, often poorly trained and with commanders who were not always up to the task. They were like a magnificent mosaic, with a few pieces of unmatched brilliance, but a great deal of less than stellar craftsmanship holding it all together. The commanders, often aristocratic members of Parliament, were chosen based on their social standing rather than their military ability. This meant the army could be brilliant one day and completely ineffectual the next. Following the victory in the north, the parliamentarian army once again failed to press its advantage, allowing the king to regroup and reinforce his army in the south. This frustration with the inconsistent performance of their own forces led to a radical proposal. A group of politicians in Parliament, including Cromwell himself, began to push for a complete overhaul of the army. They argued that victory would not come from a collection of part-time soldiers and squabbling regional commanders, but from a single, professional, national army. This new army would be unified, centrally funded, and most importantly, led by men chosen for their merit and skill, not their birthright. The idea was controversial. Many members of Parliament, and especially the aristocratic commanders, were reluctant to give up their power and influence. They feared that a professional army, loyal to Parliament as a whole rather than to individual commanders, could become a political force in its own right. This tension led to the passage of the Self-Denying Ordinance in December 1644. This act required all members of Parliament to resign their military commissions, a clever way to remove the more incompetent, politically appointed commanders. The one notable exception was Oliver Cromwell, who, due to his proven military talent, was asked to stay on and serve in the new force. The creation of the new model army was a revolutionary step. It was a standing professional army with paid soldiers and a strict code of conduct. Its soldiers were drawn from all over England, from all walks of life, and were held together by a shared Puritan zeal and a fierce dedication to their cause. The soldiers were famously disciplined, avoiding the looting and marauding that characterized other armies of the time. The officers were promoted based on their abilities, not their social status, which was an unheard of idea in the 17th century. The commander-in-chief was a skilled and methodical soldier named Sir Thomas Fairfax, a man of great courage and integrity. He was a perfect counterpart to Cromwell, who became the commander of the army's cavalry. The new model army was more than just a fighting force. It was a powerful political statement. It was a direct challenge to the old feudal system, where military service was tied to land and birthright. It represented the power of meritocracy, the idea that a man's worth was not determined by his family name, but by his talent and devotion. This new army, with its distinctive red coat uniforms, was a different kind of fighting force entirely. It was a well-oiled, well-drilled machine, a stark contrast to the rather disorganized royalist forces, and it was about to face its greatest test. The creation of the new model army was a critical turning point in the war. The parliamentarians now had a single, unified, and professional force with which to end the conflict once and for all. This new army was not only superior in its organization and discipline, but also in its motivation. The soldiers, many of them deeply religious, believed they were fighting for God's cause, to bring down a tyrannical king and to build a more just and righteous society. It was a powerful, almost spiritual conviction that would make them an unstoppable force. The war was no longer a series of skirmishes between a king and his rebellious subjects, but a clash between two fundamentally different ways of life. The creation of the new model army was the masterstroke Parliament needed to win the war. With a professional, well-drilled, and highly motivated force, they now sought to engage the king's main army and end the conflict once and for all. For a time, the two armies maneuvered across the English countryside, each seeking an advantage. The king, after a successful campaign in the Midlands, decided to try and relieve his northern garrisons. This move left the road to his temporary capital, Oxford, dangerously exposed. Parliament, seeing their chance, sent a force to lay siege to the city. Charles, rather than abandoning his stronghold, decided to march north to lift the siege. The king's army, a patchwork of veterans and new recruits, was not as disciplined as the new model army, and it was about to meet its match. In June 1645, near the village of Naseby in Northamptonshire, the two armies finally met. This was the clash everyone had been waiting for, the moment that would decide the fate of the war. The new model army, under the command of Sir Thomas Fairfax, and with Oliver Cromwell at the head of the cavalry, was well rested and prepared. The king's army, led by the king himself, and with Prince Rupert commanding the cavalry, was a mixture of confidence and exhaustion. The battle began, as was tradition, with a cavalry charge. Prince Rupert, in a display of his characteristic brilliance and recklessness, launched a thunderous attack on the parliamentarian left flank. He was so effective that he completely shattered the enemy cavalry, sending them fleeing from the field. But just as he had done at Edgehill and Marston Moor, he pursued them too far, riding off in a disorganized chase to plunder the enemy's baggage train. While Rupert was off the field, the center of the battle turned into a brutal, close quarters slugfest between the infantry. The king's soldiers, many of them veterans, fought bravely, pushing the parliamentarian center back. For a moment, it seemed as if the royalists might snatch a victory. But on the other flank, Oliver Cromwell was proving why he was the most feared cavalry commander of the war. His disciplined cavalry, the Ironsides, not only held their ground, but then launched a perfectly timed counterattack, crushing the royalist left flank. Unlike Rupert, Cromwell did not pursue the fleeing enemy. He regrouped his men and, with Fairfax, turned them to help the struggling infantry in the center. The sight of Cromwell's disciplined cavalry charging into their flank was too much for the royalist infantry. Their lines began to crumble. The king himself, seeing the situation, was reportedly urged by his advisors to lead one last desperate charge, but he was held back. The royalist army, with no reinforcements and its best cavalry off the field, began to collapse. The rout was total. The new model army swept the royalists from the field, capturing thousands of prisoners and all of the king's baggage and artillery. It was a complete and decisive victory. The Battle of Naseby was the end of the first phase of the war. While the fighting would continue for another year, the king's main field army had been annihilated. He had lost his best soldiers, his best officers, and all of his military supplies. A mainstream historical fact is that the new model army's victory at Naseby was a direct result of its superior discipline, training, and unified command structure, which contrasted sharply with the more disorganized royalist forces. With the loss of his army, the king's cause was now a lost one. He would spend the next year trying to hold on to what little he had, but the war was effectively over. The parliamentarians, with their superior army, now had the momentum, and the king had nowhere to run. The long, grinding struggle had finally found its decisive moment, and it was a moment that belonged entirely to the new model army. The devastating defeat at Naseby had shattered the king's main field army, but it didn't end the war immediately. For the next year, the conflict turned into a long, grinding campaign of sieges and mopping up operations. The king, now with a severely depleted force, spent his time on the run, a king without a kingdom in all but name. He moved from one royalist garrison to another, always a step ahead of the new model army. The parliamentarian forces, meanwhile, under the relentless command of Fairfax and Cromwell, began to systematically dismantle the remaining royalist strongholds. They captured Bristol, a key port, then laid siege to Oxford, the king's capital. Charles's situation was becoming increasingly desperate. His remaining supporters were scattered, their resources were depleted, and their morale was low. He knew that surrender was inevitable, but he still held on to a slender hope. He believed that the different factions arrayed against him, the English Parliament, the Scottish Covenanters, and the new model army, were not truly unified, and that he could play them against one another. He saw a chance to create a split, and perhaps, in the confusion, regain his throne. With the new model army closing in on Oxford, Charles made the fateful decision to flee. He slipped out of the city in disguise and rode north, not to his remaining royalist strongholds, but to the army of the Scottish Covenanters. In May 1646, Charles III surrendered himself to the Scottish army at Newark. He believed that the Scots, as his countrymen and traditional allies of the monarchy, would treat him with more respect and sympathy than the English parliamentarians. He was a king, after all, and he still believed in the sanctity of his divine right. He was, however, tragically mistaken. The Scots, for their part, saw the king as a useful pawn. They kept him in a comfortable but secure captivity while they negotiated a deal with the English Parliament. Their main goal was not to restore Charles to his full power, but to secure the payment they were owed for their military assistance and to ensure that England would become a Presbyterian nation, as promised in the Solemn League and Covenant. For the next 8 months, the king was essentially a political prisoner, a piece on a chessboard being moved by forces he could no longer control. He was held at Newcastle, a city under Scottish control, and was treated with a certain degree of decorum, but he was a captive nonetheless. The Parliament and the Scots entered into a series of lengthy negotiations. Parliament wanted to secure their victory and prevent the king from ever raising an army against them again. They offered him a number of propositions, but Charles, ever stubborn, refused to accept them. He believed that he could outweigh them all, that their divisions would eventually lead to their collapse. Historians still argue whether Charles's behavior in captivity was a display of shrewd, long-term strategy or simply a sign of his unyielding and ultimately self-destructive arrogance. He was a master of delay and obfuscation, and he used his time to sow discord between the Scots and the English. His efforts paid off in a way. The negotiations dragged on, and the Scots, growing frustrated with the lack of progress and still in need of payment, eventually decided to hand the king over to the English Parliament. In January 1647, in exchange for a large sum of money to settle their war debts, the Scots delivered Charles I to the English commissioners. He was now a prisoner of the very Parliament that had fought a war to defeat him. The long, bloody first act of the Civil War was over, and the stage was now set for the next, equally dramatic and more politically charged phase of the conflict. The war had ended, but the political crisis was just beginning. With the king now a prisoner of the English Parliament, the political landscape shifted from the battlefield to the negotiating table. But the table had a third and increasingly powerful chair, that of the new model army. The army, which had just won the war, was now a political force in its own right. The soldiers, many of them deeply Puritan, and often from a lower social standing than the politicians in Parliament, felt they had sacrificed everything for a cause that was now being hijacked by the very men who had been reluctant to fight. They were unpaid, their wages were in arrears, and they feared that a peace treaty with the king would result in them being disbanded without a proper thank you or, more importantly, a proper paycheck. The parliamentarians, for their part, were divided. A majority of the members were Presbyterians who wanted to establish a strict, state-controlled Presbyterian church and make peace with the king. They wanted to disband the new model army as soon as possible, as they saw it as a source of radicalism and instability. Opposing them were the Independents, a smaller but more influential group that included Oliver Cromwell. The Independents were wary of a state church and favored a more tolerant, decentralized religious settlement. They also had a deep distrust of the king and wanted to see his power significantly curtailed, if not abolished entirely. The king, in his captivity, was a master of exploiting these divisions. He was moved from one place to another, from Holmby House to Hampton Court Palace, and in each place he received a stream of visitors from all sides, each trying to make a deal with him. He played the Presbyterians against the Independents, the Parliament against the army. He believed that if he held out long enough, his enemies would devour each other. The more the different groups argued, the more indispensable he seemed, the only person who could possibly restore a sense of order to the fractured kingdom. The most radical voices, however, were not in Parliament, but in the army itself. Within the ranks of the New Model Army, a political movement known as the Levelers was gaining traction. They were not, as their name might suggest, people who wanted to level the social order by redistributing property. Rather, they were a group of political radicals who advocated for a more democratic society. Their leaders, men like John Lilburne, argued for fundamental rights for all men, including freedom of speech, religious toleration, and a broader franchise. They believed that the sovereignty of the nation resided in the people, not the king or parliament. Their ideas were so radical that they are now seen as one of the earliest expressions of modern democratic thought. In a series of fascinating debates held in a church in Putney, the Levelers in the Army Council debated the future of the nation with their commanders, including Cromwell and Fairfax. The debates were a microcosm of the larger struggle. The Levelers demanded a new constitution, known as the Agreement of the People, which would establish a more democratic government. Cromwell and his fellow officers were sympathetic to some of their ideas, particularly religious toleration, but they were wary of the radical democratic proposals, which they felt went too far and would lead to social chaos. The Levelers, for their part, were a bit like a modern political party, with pamphlets, petitions, and a very active public relations campaign. They were a political and social force that a century before would have been unimaginable. This period of political turmoil, with a captive king at its center, was a tense and uncertain time. The war was over, but the country was still at a crossroads. Would it return to a form of monarchy, perhaps a more limited one? Would it become a Presbyterian republic? Or would the radical ideas of the Levelers take hold and transform the entire social and political order? The king, watching and waiting, saw all of this as a reason for hope. He saw a way out, a way to regain his throne. He had no idea, of course, that his days as a king and as a free man were numbered. The king's game of playing factions against each other seemed to be working. While the parliamentarians and the New Model Army were locked in their own political struggles, Charles V remained a central, if captive, figure. He had been moved from Hampton Court to a series of more secure but less comfortable locations. The radical voices in the army, particularly the Levelers, were growing more vocal, and the atmosphere around the king was becoming more charged. Charles, however, remained confident in his ability to outmaneuver everyone. He believed that no matter what happened, the nation would ultimately prefer a king to a military dictatorship or a radical republic. His escape plan was a desperate last gamble, a roll of the dice in a game he was losing. In November 1647, the king, with the help of a few loyal servants, managed to slip away from his captivity at Hampton Court Palace. He left a series of letters behind, one of them to Parliament, promising a more moderate and compliant king if they would only come to terms with him. His escape was a sensation, but his destination was a mystery. For a few days, the nation held its breath. Was he heading to Scotland? To France? Would he rally a new army and start the war all over again? The answer, when it came, was a bit of a historical anticlimax. The king, after a few days of panicked flight, found himself with nowhere to go. He made his way to Carisbrooke Castle on the Isle of Wight, believing the governor, Robert Hammond, would be a loyal and trustworthy supporter. But Hammond was a parliamentarian, and he promptly put the king under arrest. Charles's grand escape had ended with him being a prisoner in an even more remote and secure location. But Charles's escape, even though it ended in failure, had the effect he had hoped for. It sparked a new round of fighting. His flight gave a much-needed signal to his scattered supporters that the time was right to rise up again. The Second English Civil War was not a grand unified conflict like the first, but a series of scattered, often desperate royalist uprisings across England, Scotland, and Wales. The Scots, having been snubbed by Parliament and promised that a royalist victory would secure a Presbyterian kingdom, decided to invade England once more. This new conflict was less about grand strategy and more about a final dying gasp of the royalist cause. The main royalist forces were in Kent, Wales, and the north of England, where the Scots were invading. The new model army, however, was no longer the disjointed force it had been at the beginning of the war. Under the command of Fairfax and Cromwell, it was a highly professional, well-oiled machine. Cromwell, with a speed and efficiency that was almost unheard of at the time, marched his army from London to Wales, where he quickly suppressed the uprisings there. He then turned his army north and prepared to confront the Scottish invasion force. This second phase of the war was shorter and in many ways more brutal than the first. The parliamentarians, having just negotiated a peace and now betrayed by the king, were in no mood for mercy. The fighting was fierce and the stakes were higher. A mainstream historical fact is that the Second Civil War, unlike the first, had little to do with abstract constitutional principles and was more a direct consequence of the king's political games and the army's disillusionment with a potential peace settlement. The final act of the Civil War was about to begin, and it was going to be a swift and bloody one. The king had gambled and lost, and now the price of his recklessness was about to be paid. The army, once a tool of Parliament, was now a master of its own destiny, and its patience with the king and the moderates in Parliament was at its breaking point. The stage was set for the final and most dramatic moment of the conflict. The king's attempt to restart the war had, in a sense, backfired spectacularly. Instead of reuniting his scattered forces and winning over new allies, he had simply provoked the new model army into a state of righteous anger. The soldiers, having fought and bled to end the first war, were now faced with the prospect of doing it all over again, and they were in no mood for compromise. They saw the king's actions as a profound act of betrayal, and they were determined to end the conflict once and for all, with no quarter given. The largest and most significant battle of the Second Civil War was the Battle of Preston, and it was a masterpiece of military strategy and a testament to the sheer brilliance of Oliver Cromwell. With the Scottish army numbering around 20,000 men, having invaded England and linked up with royalist forces in the north. The parliamentarian cause was in serious trouble. The Scots, under the Duke of Hamilton, had a significant numerical advantage, but they were not as disciplined as the new model army, and their forces were stretched out over a long line of march. Cromwell, with a force of only about 9,000 men, was faced with a daunting task. He knew he could not take on the entire Scottish army head-on. Instead, he made a series of rapid, forced marches to intercept them. He approached the Scots not from the front, but from the flank, a brilliant and unexpected maneuver. In August 1648, Cromwell's forces caught the Scottish army spread out on the march near the town of Preston. The battle was not a single grand engagement, but a running fight that took place over several days. Cromwell's army, with its superior discipline and firepower, was able to attack the Scottish forces piece by piece, preventing them from ever fully forming their lines. The fighting was fierce, a brutal display of close-quarters combat. The Scottish army, despite its numbers, was no match for the new model army. The parliamentarian cavalry, once again, was the decisive factor. They shattered the Scottish horsemen and then turned their attention to the infantry, which was now exposed and vulnerable. A mainstream historical fact is that Cromwell's victory at Preston was a stunning triumph of military genius over a numerically superior force. The Scots were not only defeated, but were completely routed, with thousands of prisoners taken, including the Duke of Hamilton. The defeat at Preston was the final nail in the coffin of the Royalist cause. The Scottish army, the last hope for a military restoration of the king, was annihilated. The scattered Royalist uprisings were quickly and ruthlessly put down by the new model army. The Second Civil War, which had been sparked by the king's escape, was over in a matter of months, and now the army was in a position of power that was almost unimaginable just a few years before. They were the undisputed masters of the battlefield, and they were not going to let a political settlement or a duplicitous king undermine their victory. The army's patience with Parliament was also at an end. They had fought 2 wars to defend Parliament's rights, and yet the majority of parliamentarians were still trying to negotiate a peace with a king they saw as a traitor. The soldiers, particularly the more radical members, now saw the king as Charles Stuart, that man of blood, a phrase that would soon become famous. They believed that he was not just a king who had made mistakes, but a man who was directly responsible for the deaths of thousands of their comrades. For them, there could be no more negotiation, no more compromise. The time for a final and definitive act was at hand. The Second Civil War had not only ended the Royalist cause, but it also radicalized the victorious army, setting the stage for a revolution far more profound than anyone had yet imagined. The king's attempt to restart the war had, in a sense, backfired spectacularly. Instead of reuniting his scattered forces and winning over new allies, he had simply provoked the new model army into a state of righteous anger. The soldiers, having fought and bled to end the First War, were now faced with the prospect of doing it all over again, and they were in no mood for compromise. They saw the king's actions as a profound act of betrayal, and they were determined to end the conflict once and for all, with no quarter given. The largest and most significant battle of the Second Civil War was the Battle of Preston, and it was a masterpiece of military strategy and a testament to the sheer brilliance of Oliver Cromwell. With the Scottish army numbering around 20,000 men, having invaded England and linked up with royalist forces in the north, the parliamentarian cause was in serious trouble. The Scots, under the Duke of Hamilton, had a significant numerical advantage, but they were not as disciplined as the new model army, and their forces were stretched out over a long line of march. Cromwell, with a force of only about 9,000 men, was faced with a daunting task. He knew he could not take on the entire Scottish army head-on. Instead, he made a series of rapid, forced marches to intercept them. He approached the Scots not from the front, but from the flank, a brilliant and unexpected maneuver. In August 1648, Cromwell's forces caught the Scottish army spread out on the march near the town of Preston. The battle was not a single grand engagement, but a running fight that took place over several days. Cromwell's army, with its superior discipline and firepower, was able to attack the Scottish forces piece by piece, preventing them from ever fully forming their lines. The fighting was fierce, a brutal display of close-quarters combat. The Scottish army, despite its numbers, was no match for the new model army. The parliamentarian cavalry, once again, was the decisive factor. They shattered the Scottish horsemen and then turned their attention to the infantry, which was now exposed and vulnerable. A mainstream historical fact is that Cromwell's victory at Preston was a stunning triumph of military genius over a numerically superior force. The Scots were not only defeated, but were completely routed, with thousands of prisoners taken, including the Duke of Hamilton. The defeat at Preston was the final nail in the coffin of the Royalist cause. The Scottish army, the last hope for a military restoration of the king, was annihilated. The scattered Royalist uprisings were quickly and ruthlessly put down by the new model army. The Second Civil War, which had been sparked by the king's escape, was over in a matter of months, and now the army was in a position of power that was almost unimaginable just a few years before. They were the undisputed masters of the battlefield, and they were not going to let a political settlement or a duplicitous king undermine their victory. The army's patience with Parliament was also at an end. They had fought 2 wars to defend Parliament's rights, and yet the majority of parliamentarians were still trying to negotiate a peace with a king they saw as a traitor. The soldiers, particularly the more radical members, now saw the king as Charles Stuart, that man of blood, a phrase that would soon become famous. They believed that he was not just a king who had made mistakes, but a man who was directly responsible for the deaths of thousands of their comrades. For them, there could be no more negotiation, no more compromise. The time for a final and definitive act was at hand. The Second Civil War had not only ended the Royalist cause, but had also radicalized the victorious army, setting the stage for a revolution far more profound than anyone had yet imagined. The victory at Preston had not only ended the Second Civil War, but had also created an entirely new political reality. The new model army was no longer a tool of Parliament. It was now a power unto itself. The soldiers, particularly the radical element, were convinced that they had fought and died twice to secure a victory that the king's duplicity and Parliament's weakness were now threatening to throw away. They were in no mood for another round of negotiations with a king they now saw as a man of blood who had betrayed his people. The army's anger was directed not just at the king, but at the majority of parliamentarians who were still trying to make a peace deal with him. The political situation came to a head in December 1648. Parliament, in a last-ditch effort to find a peaceful solution, passed a vote to continue negotiations with the king. This was the final straw for the army. They saw it as a direct defiance of their will and a betrayal of the cause for which so many had died. On the morning of December 6th, 1648, a regiment of soldiers under the command of Colonel Thomas Pride marched on the House of Commons. As members arrived to take their seats, Pride and his men stood at the entrance, a list of names in hand. They prevented 140 members from entering and arrested 45 more. These were the members who had voted to continue negotiations with the king. This event, known as Pride's Purge, was a military coup, a brazen and unprecedented act that ended any pretense of a constitutional settlement. It was a direct assault on the independence of Parliament. The remaining members, a small group of around 80 or so, were overwhelmingly independent and radical. This purged and compliant body became known derisively as the Rump Parliament. It was a parliament in name only, a puppet government controlled by the army. Its first act was to formally reverse the vote to continue negotiations with the king. The Rump Parliament was now ready to do the army's bidding, and the army had a very specific plan in mind for the king. With the moderates gone, the radicals were finally free to act on their convictions. For them, the king was not a figurehead to be negotiated with. He was a traitor, a tyrant, and a man who was directly responsible for the immense bloodshed of the past 7 years. They had tried to work with him, but he had repeatedly betrayed their trust. They had exhausted all legal and political options, and now they were left with only one. They would put the king on trial. This was a truly revolutionary idea. No monarch in history had ever been put on trial by his own subjects. The king, as a divinely appointed ruler, was believed to be above the law. To try him was to tear up the very fabric of society, to subvert the established order in a way that had never been done before. But the army and the Rump Parliament were not interested in tradition. They were interested in justice. They were determined to hold the king accountable for his actions, to show the world that even a king could be subject to the will of the people. The stage was now set for the most dramatic and consequential trial in British history. The trial of King Charles the Moor was an event without precedent, a moment of profound significance that echoed across Europe. The Rump Parliament, a shadow of its former self, but now filled with determined radicals, passed an ordinance to create a special High Court of Justice to try the king for treason. The charges were direct and damning that Charles Stuart, a king of England, had levied war against the present Parliament and the people therein represented, and was therefore guilty of a tyrannical and treasonous abuse of power. A king being accused of treason against his own people was an act that completely turned the established order on its head. The trial itself, which began in January 1649 in Westminster Hall, was more of a political spectacle than a legal proceeding. The king, in his dark suit and with his characteristic stubborn dignity, refused to recognize the authority of the court. He sat silently as the charges were read, and when asked to plead, he refused, arguing that no court on earth had the right to try a king. He believed that his authority came from God and not from the people, and therefore the court was an illegal and illegitimate body. He famously said, "I would know by what power I am called hither. I would know by what authority, I mean lawful authority, for there are many unlawful authorities in the world. Remember, I am your king, your lawful king." The court's president, John Bradshaw, a lawyer with a black velvet hat and a determined look, was having none of it. He and the court's prosecutors argued that the king's authority came from the law, and that a king who broke the law was no longer a king. Their argument was a groundbreaking one, a legal and philosophical revolution. They were not just trying a man, they were putting the very concept of a divine monarch on trial. The king, for his part, was calm and composed, but his refusal to plead meant that the court had no choice but to proceed with the trial without his cooperation. The proceedings were a tense and dramatic affair, watched by a mix of soldiers, politicians, and the public. The witnesses, many of them former soldiers and victims of the war, testified to the king's role in the bloodshed. They described the horrors of the battlefield, the loss of life, and the destruction of the kingdom, all of which they laid at the feet of the king. Charles, even in this moment, refused to show remorse. He believed he was the one being wronged, that he was the true martyr in this conflict. He saw himself as a man of principle, a man who was willing to die for his beliefs, and he was about to get his wish. After a few days of testimony, the court found the king guilty. The verdict was a foregone conclusion, but the public declaration of it was still a powerful and shocking moment. A mainstream historical fact is that the High Court of Justice was composed of 135 commissioners, but only 68 attended the final session and signed the death warrant, a sign of the deep unease and division even among the radicals. The death warrant was signed by the judges, including Oliver Cromwell, a man who had gone from a quiet country gentleman to a leader in the trial of his own king. The sentence was death. The execution was set for January 30th, 1649. The nation and the world held its breath. The king was to be put to death, and with him, the ancient sacred tradition of the divine right of kings would be buried as well. The morning of January 30th, 1649, was a cold, gray day in London. A deep, penetrating chill hung in the air, a fitting atmosphere for the shocking event that was about to unfold. Scaffolding had been erected outside the banqueting house at Whitehall Palace, a structure designed by the great architect Inigo Jones. It was a beautiful building, a testament to the high art and culture of the very monarch who was about to be executed on its doorstep. A large, silent crowd had gathered, their breath visible in the frosty air. The city was under a heavy military presence, the red coats of the new model army standing guard, a silent but intimidating presence that made it clear this was not a moment for dissent or protest. King Charles I was led from St. James's Palace to the scaffold. He walked with a calm, almost serene dignity, a man who, in the face of his own mortality, seemed to have finally found the resolve that had so often eluded him in life. He was dressed in a thick wool waistcoat to prevent him from shivering, so as to not give the impression that he was afraid. His last request was a simple one, to be allowed to wear 2 shirts. He did not want to show any weakness. He gave a final brief speech, a calm and collected defense of his actions, arguing that he was a martyr for the people of England and for the freedom of the true government. He still believed to his last breath that his authority came from God and that he was dying for the liberty of the people who he said were not meant to have a share in government. A little bit of a mixed message there. He knelt, and a single, silent blow from the masked executioner's axe ended his life. The execution was so swift and so final that the crowd, which had been silent for so long, let out a collective moan, a sound of horror, grief, and awe. The executioner then held up the king's severed head, an act of defiance and a final brutal message to all of Europe. The message was clear. No one, not even a king, was above the law, and the ancient sacred tradition of the divine right of kings had just been shattered. The execution of Charles I was an event that sent a shudder through every royal court in Europe. It was a moment that fundamentally changed the course of British history. A monarch had been put to death, not by a rival, but by his own subjects, for crimes against his own people. A mainstream historical fact is that the execution was so shocking that many of the royal courts in Europe went into a period of mourning and refused to recognize the new English government. The very idea of a king being executed was a concept that was both terrifying and revolutionary. It showed the world that a new, dangerous idea was loose in the world, the idea that the power to govern lay not in a monarch, but in the people themselves. With the king dead, the Rump Parliament, in a series of swift and decisive moves, abolished the monarchy and the House of Lords. They declared England to be a commonwealth and a free state. The new government was a republic, ruled by a council of state, with no king and no hereditary nobility. This was the first time in its history that England was governed as a republic. The new rulers were a mixture of radical politicians and army officers, and they now faced the daunting task of not only governing a fractured kingdom, but also defending their new republic from a world that saw them as regicides and revolutionaries. The long, bloody struggle had finally come to its conclusion, but the peace that followed was an uneasy one, a temporary calm before another storm. The old world was dead, but the new one was still struggling to be born. With the king's head on the block and the monarchy abolished, England was now a commonwealth, a republic governed by a council of state. The Rump Parliament, for all its revolutionary zeal, was now faced with the daunting task of governing a deeply fractured and unstable nation. They were regicides in the eyes of most of Europe, and they were surrounded by enemies both at home and abroad. The new government had to assert its authority, and it would do so with the ruthless efficiency of the new model army, the very force that had brought it to power. The first and most pressing issue was to deal with the rebellion in Ireland. The country was still in a state of chaos, with a mix of royalist, Catholic, and native Irish forces still in control of large swaths of land. For the English, Ireland was a source of great anxiety and a potential staging ground for a royalist comeback. In 1649, Oliver Cromwell, the newly appointed commander-in-chief of the army, was dispatched to Ireland with a force of 12,000 men. His mission was simple: to crush the rebellion and bring the country under the firm control of the Commonwealth. Cromwell's campaign in Ireland was swift, brutal, and utterly devastating. The two most infamous events of the campaign were the sieges of Drogheda and Wexford. At Drogheda, a town held by a mix of English royalists and Irish Catholic Confederates, Cromwell's forces stormed the town and, in a notorious act of vengeance, put the entire garrison and a number of civilians to the sword. Cromwell himself, in his dispatches to Parliament, justified the act as a righteous judgment from God, a punishment for the Irish massacre of Protestants that had sparked the rebellion years before. A little bit of a justification for what was to many a war crime. At Wexford, the story was much the same. Cromwell's men stormed the town, and in a scene of similar carnage, slaughtered both soldiers and civilians. Historians still argue whether Cromwell's actions in Ireland were a premeditated act of genocide or a terrible but standard act of 17th century warfare. Regardless of the intent, the result was a campaign that left a lasting and bitter legacy of suffering and religious hatred. The campaign was successful in its goal, however. Cromwell's army, with its superior discipline and overwhelming firepower, quickly crushed the remaining resistance. By the time he left in 1650, a significant portion of Ireland was under Commonwealth control. The land was then confiscated and given to English Protestant settlers and to the soldiers of the new model army. This was an act that would fuel Irish resentment for centuries to come. While Cromwell was in Ireland, another problem was brewing closer to home. The Scots, having been defeated at Preston, now had a change of heart. They had their own king, Charles I's son, Charles II, and they now saw a chance to restore the monarchy, albeit a Presbyterian one. In 1650, they crowned Charles II as King of Scotland and invited him to lead an army to invade England and reclaim his throne. Cromwell, having returned from Ireland, was immediately sent north to deal with this new threat. The Scots, with their new king, were a formidable force, but they made a critical error. They were divided between the more moderate Presbyterian royalists and the more radical Covenanters. Cromwell, with a much smaller force, was able to outmaneuver them, and in a surprise attack at the Battle of Dunbar, he completely routed the Scottish army. It was a stunning victory, a testament to Cromwell's military genius. He then marched on Scotland, capturing Edinburgh and most of the country. The Scots, however, were not entirely defeated. In 1651, they made one last desperate gamble. They marched their army south into England, hoping to raise support for Charles II and rally the remaining royalists. The stage was set for a final, decisive confrontation. The year 1651 saw the final military act of the English Civil Wars. With Cromwell occupied in Scotland, King Charles II, the young monarch in waiting, saw his chance. He led his army of Scottish supporters south into England, hoping to spark a massive royalist uprising. He was, to some extent, correct in his belief that many English royalists were tired of the new Commonwealth government and were willing to fight for a restoration of the monarchy. But his hopes for a large-scale rebellion were not met. The English people, having just endured a decade of conflict, were weary of war. The new model army, meanwhile, was quick to respond. Cromwell, ever the brilliant tactician, left a portion of his army in Scotland and marched his main force south with a breathtaking speed that a 17th century army was not supposed to possess. The young king and his army reached the city of Worcester, where they were joined by a small number of English royalists. They decided to make their stand there, a gamble that would prove to be their last. Cromwell's army, joined by local militias, surrounded the city, and on September 30, 1651, they launched a full-scale assault. The Battle of Worcester was a one-sided affair, a testament to the sheer superiority of the new model army. Cromwell's forces attacked from multiple directions, overwhelming the royalist defenses. The fighting was fierce, but short-lived. The royalist army was completely annihilated, with thousands killed and a staggering number of prisoners taken. The young King Charles II managed to escape the battlefield, but his journey was a long, harrowing, and legendary tale of survival. For 6 weeks, he was a fugitive in his own country, hiding from parliamentarian troops. He famously hid in an oak tree and at one point disguised himself as a servant. It was a classic historical story of a king on the run. He finally managed to escape to France, where he would spend the next 9 years in exile, a king without a throne. The victory at Worcester was the final, definitive military triumph of the parliamentarian cause. The royalist threat had been completely neutralized. A mainstream historical fact is that the Battle of Worcester, which Cromwell himself called his crowning mercy, effectively ended the English Civil War. It secured the Commonwealth's power and left no doubt about who was in control of England, Scotland, and Ireland. The nation was now a republic, and the man who had done the most to make it so was Oliver Cromwell. With the military conflict at an end, the political tension between the new model army and the Rump Parliament was about to come to a head. The army had won the war, and they felt that the Rump Parliament had not delivered on the promises of the Revolution. They felt that the Parliament was a corrupt, self-serving body that had outlived its usefulness. They were tired of the politicians who had grown rich and powerful during the war and who were now refusing to hold new elections or to enact the reforms that the soldiers had fought for. The soldiers, for all their idealism, were also practical men, and they wanted to be paid. The Rump Parliament, for its part, was terrified of the army and its demands. They were a small, unrepresentative body, and they knew their power came only from the goodwill of the military. They tried to stall, to delay, to pass laws that would protect their own power, but their time was running out. The man who had won the war was about to put an end to the political squabbles and install a government that he felt would truly serve the people. The stage was set for the final act of this political drama. The Battle of Worcester had been Cromwell's crowning mercy, but it did not bring the political peace he and his army desired. With the king defeated and in exile, and the royalist cause utterly crushed, the new model army had a new enemy, the Rump Parliament itself. The soldiers had fought for a new and better England, a nation free from tyranny, and they believed the Rump Parliament, for all its revolutionary rhetoric, was failing to deliver. They saw a body of men who were more interested in feathering their own nests and clinging to power than in enacting the reforms the nation so desperately needed. The Parliament, for its part, was in no hurry to disband itself or to hold new elections, knowing full well that they would likely be voted out of office. The tension between the two bodies grew to a fever pitch in 1653. The army, through a series of petitions and meetings, demanded that Parliament dissolve itself and hold new elections. The parliamentarians, in a move of defiance, began to debate a bill that would set a date for future elections, but would also ensure that the current members would keep their seats, a blatant attempt to entrench their own power. This was the final straw for Oliver Cromwell. He saw the bill as a betrayal of everything the army had fought for. On April 20th, 1653, Cromwell, ever the man of action, marched to the House of Commons with a company of musketeers. As he entered the chamber, he was calm, but his words were like daggers. He listened for a while to the debates, and then he rose and began to speak. He started with a polite but firm speech, but as he grew more passionate, his tone shifted. He accused the members of being corrupt, of being self-serving, and of having failed the nation. He famously told them, "You have been sat too long for any good you have been doing lately. In the name of God, go." It was a dramatic and unprecedented moment. A soldier, a general, was ordering a parliament to dissolve. The Speaker of the House, a man named William Lenthal, refused to leave his chair. Cromwell, in a theatrical gesture, ordered his men to clear the room. He pointed to the mace, the symbol of parliamentary authority, and famously said, "What shall we do with this bauble? Take it away." The soldiers cleared the room, and Cromwell, now the undisputed master of England, locked the doors of the House of Commons behind him. This event, known as the dissolution of the Rump Parliament, was the end of the English Commonwealth as a parliamentary republic. It was a coup, plain and simple, a military takeover of a civilian government. Cromwell, who had fought to defend Parliament against the king, had now dissolved it himself. It was a moment of profound irony, a testament to how far the revolution had strayed from its original goals. A mainstream historical fact is that Cromwell in this moment was not acting out of a desire for personal power, but out of a deep frustration with what he saw as the political corruption and inaction of the Rump Parliament. Cromwell, now in absolute control, had to figure out what to do next. He was not a king, and he did not want to be. He was a man who believed in a government guided by God, but he also believed in order and stability. He tried a number of different approaches, including an assembly of hand-picked religious men known as the Bare-Bones Parliament, but they were too radical and idealistic to govern effectively. The experiment in a true parliamentary republic had failed. The nation, having been without a king and a proper government for years, was crying out for a strong hand to guide it, and that strong hand was about to take on a new and more powerful form. With the Rump Parliament dissolved, Cromwell was in a position of supreme authority, but he was a man who, by all accounts, was deeply uncomfortable with the idea of a personal dictatorship. He tried to govern with a number of different assemblies and councils, but they were all short-lived and ineffective. The country was in a state of political drift, and it was becoming clear that a new form of government was needed to bring a sense of stability and order. The army, which had always been the source of Cromwell's power, had its own ideas, and they were beginning to push for a more centralized and stable government. In December 1653, a new constitution was adopted. It was called the Instrument of Government, and it was the first written constitution in English history. It was a groundbreaking document that established a new form of government known as the Protectorate. The country would no longer be a commonwealth, but a protectorate, and at its head would be a single person, a Lord Protector. This was a new title, a new role, and it was an office created specifically for Oliver Cromwell. He was not a king, but he was a head of state with more power than most monarchs. He had the authority to command the army, to appoint his own council of state, and to veto parliamentary legislation. It was, in all but name, a military dictatorship, and the man who had fought to overthrow a king now found himself a de facto king in all but name. Cromwell's rule as Lord Protector was a period of both great ambition and great contradiction. He was a deeply religious man who believed that God had chosen him to lead England. He saw himself not as a tyrant, but as a shepherd, a man who was guiding the nation toward a more righteous and godly path. He tried to enforce a Puritan moral code on the country, banning things like Christmas celebrations, gambling, and a number of other entertainments. He even went so far as to create a number of regional military governors, known as the Major Generals, who were tasked with enforcing his moral reforms. This was a particularly unpopular move, as the English people, for all their Puritan tendencies, were not used to being told how to live by a group of soldiers. Cromwell's foreign policy, however, was a master class in strategic thinking. He was a staunch Protestant who saw England as the leader of the Protestant world. He fought a war with the Catholic Spanish Empire, and in a stroke of military genius, captured the Spanish colony of Jamaica, which would become a jewel in the English crown. He also signed a number of lucrative trade deals with other European powers, and for a time, England was more powerful and more respected on the international stage than it had been in decades. Despite his successes, Cromwell's rule was never entirely stable. There were constant assassination plots, and the public, for all its desire for order, was not entirely comfortable with the idea of a military man ruling the country. He had to dissolve Parliament twice during his rule, as they were often at odds with his more authoritarian tendencies. He was a man who had won the war, but he had lost the peace. He had replaced one form of tyranny with another, and the very liberty he had fought for was now being curtailed in the name of a righteous, godly government. A mainstream historical fact is that Cromwell was offered the crown of England in 1657, but he famously refused it, a testament to his own personal conviction and his fear of becoming what he had so publicly fought against. He was a man who was burdened by the crown he refused to wear, a king in all but name. The Protectorate, for all its power and stability, was ultimately a government that rested on the shoulders of a single man. The question of succession, of what would happen when Oliver Cromwell died, was a constant source of anxiety. Cromwell himself, despite his rejection of the title of king, did very little to prepare a clear and stable line of succession. He was a man who believed in providence, in God's will, and he seemed to believe that God would provide a successor when the time came. The people around him, however, were not so certain. They were tired of the constant political instability and were looking for a clear, hereditary line of succession to ensure a peaceful transition of power. On a hot day in September 1658, Oliver Cromwell, the Lord Protector of England, passed away. His death was a quiet affair, a sharp contrast to the thunderous life he had led. He died on the anniversary of his great victories at Dunbar and Worcester, a fact that his Puritan followers saw as a sign of God's favor, a final, poignant wink from a man who had always believed he was doing God's work. His son, our Richard Cromwell, was immediately proclaimed the new Lord Protector. Richard was, by all accounts, a quiet, gentle man, a man who loved country life and was not at all suited for the rough and tumble world of politics and military command. He was, to put it mildly, a bit of a dud. Richard Cromwell was known as Tumbledown Dick for a reason. He lacked his father's charisma, his iron will, and his command of the military. The army, which had always been the backbone of the Protectorate, had no respect for him. The old political and religious factions that had been suppressed by Oliver now began to re-emerge, sensing a weakness in the new regime. The military commanders, sensing an opportunity to regain their influence, began to openly defy Richard. They wanted a return to the military-dominated government of his father, and they saw Richard as a soft, civilian leader who was not up to the task. The political instability that followed Oliver Cromwell's death was swift and all-encompassing. Richard Cromwell, unable to control the army or the warring factions in Parliament, was forced to resign after less than a year in power. He simply abdicated his power, a man who had never wanted it in the first place. With him went the last vestiges of the Protectorate. England was now a republic with no clear leader, no clear form of government, and a powerful but directionless army that was once again a political force in its own right. The country descended into a state of political chaos, a period known as the Anarchy. It was a time of political backroom deals, military posturing, and a growing sense of a nation that was weary of revolution and was ready for a return to a more stable, familiar form of government. The political vacuum was a dangerous one. There were a number of different factions that vied for power, but none of them had the popular support or the military might to hold the country together. The people who had fought and bled for liberty were now living in a state of constant uncertainty. They longed for the stability of the old days, for a time when there was a king on the throne and a clear line of authority. This longing, this deep-seated desire for a return to normalcy, was a powerful force, and it was a force that was about to bring about the most surprising and peaceful end to the great English Civil War. A mainstream historical fact is that the Anarchy, the period between the fall of the Protectorate and the restoration of the monarchy, was a time of deep uncertainty and political chaos, a testament to the fact that a nation, for all its revolutionary ideals, still needs a stable form of government to function. The political chaos that followed the collapse of the Protectorate was a powerful demonstration that a nation, even a revolutionary one, craves stability. The country was in a state of political freefall. A number of different military and political factions vied for power, but none of them had the authority or the popular support to unite the nation. The army, once a disciplined and unified force, was now a collection of different regiments and commanders, each with their own political agenda. The Rump Parliament was recalled, but it was just as ineffectual and self-serving as it had been before. The English people, tired of the constant political turmoil, were beginning to look to the past for a solution. The exiled son of the man who had lost his head now seemed like the most logical and unifying answer to the nation's problems. The man who would finally bring about this change was not a politician, but a soldier, a general who had served under Cromwell. His name was George Monk. He was the commander of the English forces in Scotland, and he was a man of quiet, almost silent pragmatism. He watched the chaos in England with a sense of dread, and he came to a simple conclusion. The only way to restore order was to bring back the monarchy. He was not a royalist, and he was not a republican. He was a man who wanted a stable, functioning government, and he knew that the only way to get it was to bring back the exiled king. In 1660, Monk marched his army from Scotland to London, a move that was watched with a mixture of fear and hope. He was a man of few words, and he did not declare his intentions. He simply marched, a slow, methodical force moving toward the heart of the kingdom. As he neared London, a sense of relief and anticipation began to sweep through the country. The army, the very force that had been the engine of the revolution, was now about to become the instrument of its undoing. Once in London, Monk acted with a quiet, almost understated genius. He did not seize power himself. He simply gave the people what they wanted, a free parliament. He helped to restore the members who had been expelled in Pride's Purge, a move that effectively undid the military coup and restored a more representative and more moderate parliament. The newly restored parliament immediately began a series of secret negotiations with the exiled king. A mainstream historical fact is that Monk's peaceful march to London and his subsequent actions were key to the bloodless nature of the Restoration, a powerful contrast to the violent events that had preceded it. Meanwhile, the King Charles II was in Holland, watching and waiting. He was a very different man from his father. He was a shrewd, charming, and politically savvy man who had learned from his father's mistakes. He issued a document known as the Declaration of Breda. In it, he promised a general pardon for all those who had fought against his father, with a few exceptions. He promised to respect Parliament, to allow for a degree of religious toleration, and to pay the army their arrears. It was a brilliant move, a promise of peace, stability, and a return to the ancient constitution. It was everything the people were longing for. The Declaration was a powerful and unifying force. It made the king's return seem not like a military invasion, but a peaceful and desired restoration of the old order. In May 1660, Charles II landed at Dover and was met by a jubilant crowd. The journey to London was a triumphant parade, a moment of national celebration. He entered London on his 30th birthday, and he was greeted with cheers, bells, and a massive, joyous procession. The long, bloody nightmare of the Civil War was over. The monarchy had been restored, and with it, a sense of peace and stability that the nation had not known in a generation. The return of Charles II was a moment of national celebration, a collective sigh of relief for a nation that had been through a decade of war and political instability. The event, known as the Restoration, was not just the return of a king, it was the return of a sense of normalcy, of a familiar order that had been shattered by revolution. The people, who had once fought to overthrow a king, were now fighting to bring one back. But the monarchy that was restored was not the same one that had been abolished. The English Civil War had a profound and lasting legacy, and it was a legacy that would shape the future of Britain forever. The first and most important lesson of the Civil War was that a king could not rule without Parliament. The monarchy had been restored, but it was now a constitutional monarchy, a system in which the king's power was limited by law and by Parliament. Charles II, unlike his father, was a man who understood the need for compromise. He governed with a Parliament, and he did not try to rule by divine right. He was a king, but he was a king who knew that his power was not absolute. The Parliament, for its part, was now a more powerful and self-confident institution. It had tasted power, and it was not going to give it up. The Civil War also had a profound impact on religion. While the Restoration brought back the Church of England, it also created a lasting legacy of religious toleration. The Puritan dream of a godly society had failed, but the fight for religious freedom had not been in vain. The dissenters, the nonconformists who had fought for religious liberty, were now a permanent part of the English landscape. They were no longer a small, persecuted minority, but a powerful and organized force. The government, for all its attempts to enforce religious conformity, was now faced with a powerful and organized opposition that would not simply go away. The war also had a massive impact on the military. The new model army, the very force that had won the war and made the Restoration possible, was disbanded. A mainstream historical fact is that the Parliament, in an act of political self-preservation, immediately ordered the army to be disbanded, fearing that it would become a political force once again. The soldiers, the men who had fought and bled for a cause they believed in, were now simply sent home with a few exceptions. The experience of a professional standing army, however, was not forgotten. The government would continue to rely on a small, professional military, but it would always be subject to the control of Parliament, a direct result of the fear of a military dictatorship. The Restoration was, in many ways, a peaceful end to a bloody and tumultuous period, but it was not a complete return to the past. The legacy of the Civil War was everywhere. The memory of a king who lost his head, of a nation that had fought a war for its liberty, was a powerful and enduring one. The war had shown that the power to govern lay not in a monarch, but in the people, and it was a lesson that would not be forgotten. The conflict had changed the course of British history forever, and its consequences would continue to be felt for centuries to come. The long, winding, and often terrifying road of the English Civil War was over, but the ideas it had unleashed were now loose in the world, and they would continue to shape the political and social landscape of a nation that had learned the hard way that a king, for all his divine right, was a man, and a man could be held to account. The period of the Protectorate under Oliver Cromwell and the subsequent collapse of his government in the anarchy had shown the English people that the solution to their problems was not a king, nor a parliament, nor a military dictatorship, but a combination of all three in a balanced and functional government. The restoration of Charles II was a tacit acknowledgement of this fact. It was not an unconditional surrender to the monarchy, but a negotiated settlement, a political deal that sought to preserve the peace and prevent the nation from falling back into the abyss of civil war. The new political reality was a fragile one, and it was tested almost immediately. The first years of the Restoration were dominated by a desire to undo the past. Parliament passed a series of laws known as the Clarendon Code, a collection of acts that were designed to punish and persecute the dissenters, the nonconformists who had fought for Parliament during the war. This was an attempt to restore the old religious order and to silence the voices of dissent that had caused so much trouble. But it was a failed attempt. The dissenters were too numerous, too well organized, and too committed to their beliefs to be simply legislated away. They would continue to be a powerful and enduring force in English life, a constant reminder of the war that had been fought for their right to worship freely. The Restoration also brought with it a series of high-profile trials for the men who had signed the king's death warrant. They were tried as traitors, as regicides, and a number of them were executed. This was a moment of public vengeance, a symbolic act that sought to wipe the slate clean and punish those who had been responsible for the king's death. A mainstream historical fact is that the bodies of Oliver Cromwell, John Bradshaw, and Henry Ireton were exhumed and ceremoniously hanged at Tyburn, a grotesque but powerful display of royal justice and a final, symbolic act of revenge. But for all its attempts to turn back the clock, the Restoration could not erase the memory of the Civil War. The political landscape of England had been fundamentally and permanently altered. The war had created a new kind of political consciousness, a new kind of political discourse. The people and Parliament were no longer passive subjects, but active participants in the government. The idea of popular sovereignty, the idea that the power to rule came from the people, not from a monarch, was now a permanent part of the national conversation. The years that followed the Restoration were a period of relative peace and stability, but the underlying tensions remained. The king, Charles II, was a man who, despite his charm, had a complicated relationship with Parliament. He was always in need of money, and Parliament, now a more powerful and assertive body, was often reluctant to give it to him. The king's open Catholicism and his brother James's even more open and devout Catholicism was a constant source of anxiety for a nation that was still deeply Protestant. The fear of a return to the religious wars of the past was always present, a constant undercurrent to the political drama of the day. The English Civil War, then, did not end with the restoration of the monarchy. It simply transformed into a new kind of political conflict, a conflict that would be fought not with swords and muskets, but with words, with laws, and with political maneuvering. The old question of who held the ultimate power in England, the king or a parliament, had been settled, but it had not been forgotten. The legacy of the war, a legacy of liberty and of limited government, would continue to shape the course of British history for centuries to come. The legacy of the English Civil War continued to ripple through the political landscape of England for generations. The Restoration had restored the monarchy, but the question of who held the ultimate power, the king or parliament, remained an open one. This tension would come to a head in the reign of Charles II's brother, James II. James was a devout and open Catholic, and his attempts to grant religious freedom to Catholics and to rule without Parliament's consent were seen by many as a direct threat to the Protestant faith and the liberties of the English people. The fear of a Catholic dynasty and of another bloody war led to a final and decisive act. In 1688, a group of prominent English politicians and religious leaders invited William of Orange, the Protestant ruler of the Netherlands and the husband of James's Protestant daughter Mary, to invade England. They promised to support him if he would come and secure the Protestant faith and the liberties of the English people. William, who had his own political reasons for wanting to weaken the Catholic French king Louis XIV, accepted the invitation. He landed in England with a small army, and he was met not with resistance, but with widespread support. The English people, the army, and the navy all flocked to his side. James II, realizing he had no support, fled to France. This event, known as the Glorious Revolution, was a bloodless coup, a final and definitive victory for Parliament. It was a revolution, not of the sword, but of political will. A mainstream historical fact is that the Glorious Revolution was a peaceful and decisive conclusion to the struggle for power between the monarchy and Parliament that had begun with the English Civil War. The Parliament, now in control, passed a number of laws that would cement their power and finally settle the question of who held the ultimate authority in England. The most important of these was the Bill of Rights of 1689. This document, a cornerstone of British law, established a number of fundamental rights for the English people. It limited the power of the monarch, ensuring that they could not suspend laws, raise taxes, or maintain a standing army without the consent of Parliament. It also established the principle of a constitutional monarchy, a government in which the monarch's power was limited by law. It also guaranteed a number of fundamental rights, including the right to a fair trial, freedom of speech in Parliament, and the right to petition the government. The Glorious Revolution and the Bill of Rights were the final and most profound legacies of the English Civil War. The war had shown that a king who ruled without Parliament's consent was a king who could be overthrown. The Glorious Revolution was a peaceful confirmation of this truth. The war had been a bloody, violent, and chaotic affair, but its ultimate outcome was a peaceful and lasting political settlement. The monarchy was not abolished, but it was permanently and irrevocably limited. The power to govern now rested not in a single man, but in a balanced and functional government of a king, a parliament, and the law. The ideas that had been unleashed by the Civil War, the ideas of liberty, of limited government, and of the rights of the people, were now a permanent part of the British political landscape. They would continue to shape the course of British history for centuries to come, and they would go on to inspire revolutionaries and reformers all over the world. The long, bloody struggle for power was over, and it had been won not by a king nor by a military dictator, but by the will of the people, represented in a powerful and unyielding parliament. The story of the English Civil War and its aftermath is a powerful lesson in how a nation can be fundamentally and permanently changed by a period of profound conflict. The war did not just change who ruled England, it changed how England was ruled. The legacy of the war can be seen in the very fabric of British political life, from the limited power of the monarch to the supreme authority of Parliament. The long, bloody struggle between the king and his Parliament had in the end created a new and more stable form of government, a government that was more representative and more accountable to the people. The Civil War also had a profound impact on the idea of a standing army. The experience of the New Model Army, a professional, full-time military force, had been a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it had been a brilliant and effective fighting force that had won the war. On the other hand, it had become a political force in its own right, a source of constant instability and a threat to civilian government. The Parliament, having been purged by the army, was in no mood to ever let a standing army become a political power again. The solution was to disband the army and to ensure that any future military force would be subject to the direct control of Parliament. Historians still argue whether the English Civil War was a truly revolutionary event. Some argue that it was a simple conflict between a stubborn king and a powerful parliament, and that the ultimate outcome was simply a return to the traditional balance of power. Others argue that it was a truly revolutionary event, a moment that fundamentally and permanently changed the course of British history. They point to the execution of a king, the abolition of the monarchy, and the establishment of a republic as evidence of a truly revolutionary spirit. Regardless of how you see it, the fact remains that the war had a profound and lasting impact. The war also created a powerful legacy of political discourse and of public participation in politics. The pamphlets, the newspapers, and the petitions of the Civil War era created a new kind of political consciousness. The people were no longer just passive subjects. They were now active participants in the political drama of the day. The ideas of liberty, of rights, and of a government that was accountable to the people were now a permanent part of the national conversation. The people, having tasted a form of liberty, were not going to give it up. The Civil War was a traumatic and bloody experience for the English people. It was a time of brother fighting brother, of communities divided, and of a nation that was at war with itself. But for all its horror, it was also a period of profound change and of lasting consequence. The war had shown that a nation could and would fight for its liberty. It had shown that a government that was not accountable to the people was a government that would not last, and it had, in the end, created a new and more stable form of government, a government that would become a model for the world. The long and bloody road of the English Civil War was a difficult one, but it was a road that ultimately led to a more free, a more just, and a more stable nation. The long, winding, and often terrifying road of the English Civil War did not end with the Restoration or even the Glorious Revolution. The legacy of the conflict continued to shape the political and social landscape of Britain for centuries to come, and its ideas would even travel across the Atlantic to inspire a new generation of revolutionaries. The American Revolution, with its rallying cries of no taxation without representation, and its firm belief in a government that derived its power from the consent of the governed, was in many ways a direct descendant of the English Civil War. The American colonists, many of whom were dissenters who had fled England to escape religious persecution, were deeply steeped in the ideas of liberty and limited government that had been forged in the crucible of the Civil War. The English Civil War and the subsequent constitutional settlement also had a profound impact on the rest of the world. The image of a king being put on trial and executed by his own people was a powerful and shocking one, a moment that showed the world that a new, dangerous idea was loose in the world, the idea of popular sovereignty. This idea would go on to inspire revolutionaries in France, in America, and all over the world. The execution of Charles I was a symbol, a powerful and brutal reminder that the power to govern lay not in a monarch, but in the people. The war also had a lasting impact on British society. The puritanical zeal that had fueled the new model army would go on to shape a new kind of English character, a character that was more serious, more industrious, and more committed to a sense of moral rectitude. The Puritans, for all their faults, were a people who believed in a government that was fair and just, and their ideas would continue to influence English society for centuries to come. The war had also created a new kind of political and social mobility, a world in which a man could rise not by his birthright, but by his talent. A man like Oliver Cromwell, a quiet country gentleman, could become the most powerful man in the nation, a testament to the fact that the old social order was no longer as rigid as it had once been. The war, for all its horror, was a moment of profound national transformation. It was a moment when a nation had to ask itself a fundamental question: who are we and who do we want to be? The answer, as it turned out, was a nation that was more free, more just, and more accountable to its people. The war had been a bloody and traumatic experience, but its ultimate outcome was a peaceful and lasting political settlement. The long, winding, and often terrifying road of the English Civil War had come to a close, but the ideas it had unleashed would continue to shape the course of a nation and a world for centuries to come. And so, we come to the final chapter of our long journey through the history of the English Civil War. We have seen a quiet, stubborn king and a resolute parliament clash over power and principle. We have seen a nation torn apart, with neighbor fighting neighbor and brother fighting brother. We have seen a bloody struggle that ended in the execution of a king and the establishment of a republic. And we have seen that republic fall, only to be replaced by a military dictatorship and finally a restored monarchy. But what we have also seen is that a nation, for all its flaws, can learn from its mistakes. The English Civil War was not a story of a single victory or a single defeat, but a story of a nation that was able to take the lessons of its past and build a more stable, a more just, and a more free future. The monarchy was restored, but it was a new monarchy, a monarchy that was permanently and irrevocably limited by law and by parliament. The legacy of the war, a legacy of liberty and limited government, would go on to shape the course of British history for centuries to come. As the story of this long and tumultuous period settles in your mind, you can perhaps imagine the quiet countryside returning to a sense of peace. The fields that had once been stained with the blood of soldiers now grew green with new crops. The towns that had been torn by conflict began to rebuild, and the people, tired of the endless struggle, began to heal. The echoes of the muskets and the cries of the men on the battlefield began to fade, replaced by the gentle rustle of the wind through the trees and the quiet, steady rhythm of a nation at peace. The grand questions of who would rule and by what right had been answered. The stories of kings and generals, of common men and great ideas, now sank into the deep, quiet waters of history where they sleep, waiting to be rediscovered. And as they sleep, you too can find your own quiet rest. The long journey is over, and the time for dreams has come. The great, sweeping epic of a nation at war with itself has found its quiet end. You can let the final images of a nation at peace, of a world that has finally found its way home, settle around you like a soft blanket. The sound of the wind, the gentle light of the moon, and the quiet rhythm of the night. End of script. Sweet dreams.